Detective Michael Ramirez, a seasoned officer, finds himself at the heart of a public protest after body cam footage surfaces, revealing his use of excessive force during a routine arrest. As the protests intensify, Michael must confront his own actions, facing a woman who holds him personally accountable for her brother's death. This is a story about accountability, the weight of one's actions, and the struggle to come to terms with the truth. Welcome to Touching Tales. Thank you for joining us here, where every story challenges perspectives and ignites deep reflection. In today's tale, we dive into the life of a man who thought he was in control, only to discover that the truth can never be hidden forever. Now, let's begin. The morning air felt unnaturally cold as Detective Michael Ramirez stepped out of his car, the weight of the badge on his chest heavier than it had ever been. The streets were quieter than usual. Perhaps it was the chill, or maybe it was the simmering tension that had been building over the last few weeks. He had been warned about the protests, but nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. Across the street, a group of activists stood in front of City Hall, their signs raised high with messages calling for justice. They had been protesting for days now, demanding accountability for the officers involved in the death of a young black man in their neighborhood. Michael had been a cop for years, but today felt different. Today, he was on the other side. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his partner, Detective Maria Jenkins. "They're waiting for you." He didn't need to ask who they were. The media had gathered, as had his fellow officers, waiting to see how he would handle the public scrutiny that had come with the leaked body cam footage of him using excessive force during a routine arrest. The footage had gone viral. Now, the whole city was watching. Michael walked toward the crowd, trying to maintain his composure. He had never been one to show weakness, especially in public, but today, it felt impossible to pretend everything was fine. "You're the one from the video, aren't you?" A voice broke through his thoughts, sharp and accusatory. Michael looked up to see a woman, Maya Carter, standing just a few feet away. He recognized her immediately. She was the sister of the young man who had died. Her eyes were fierce, filled with a mix of grief and anger. "Yes, I'm Detective Ramirez," he said, trying to sound confident, though his voice betrayed him. "I've been assigned to handle the situation." "No," Maya snapped. "You don't get to handle anything anymore." She stepped closer, her voice rising. "You don't get to walk away from this like it's just another case. People are dead, Detective. My brother is dead because of people like you." The crowd around them fell silent, all eyes on Michael. The pressure of their gaze felt suffocating, and for the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about his job, about the justice he had sworn to uphold. "You don't know what it's like out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know the pressure we face every day. It's not black and white." "Then make it black and white." Maya shot back. "Make the truth clear. You can't keep hiding behind excuses." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was right. He had spent years justifying his actions, telling himself that his training and instincts were all that mattered. But the truth was, he had failed to see the human cost of his decisions. Maya's eyes bore into his, unflinching. "Do you even know what it feels like to be scared for your life every day, Michael? To be treated like an enemy just because of the color of your skin?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the weight of it settled over him. For a moment, Michael didn't know how to respond. He had always thought of himself as the protector, the one who brought justice, but now he wasn't sure if he even understood what justice really was. The crowd had started murmuring again, and Michael knew he was losing their trust. He could feel the eyes of every single person on him, waiting for him to say something, anything, that might redeem him in their eyes. But there was nothing left to say. The truth was right in front of him, plain as day. Maya's voice softened, but there was no mistaking the conviction behind it. "You have a chance to make this right, but it starts with you. The system won't change if you don't change, Michael." She turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing there, alone in front of the crowd, for the first time truly questioning everything he had ever believed about his role in the world. The weeks that followed were a blur. Michael barely slept, his mind racing through the events of the protest, the heated words exchanged with Maya, and the subsequent media frenzy that had turned his life upside down. Every news station seemed to be running a story on the leaked footage, with commentary on his actions, the protest, and the public outcry. He couldn't escape it, no matter how hard he tried. His colleagues at the precinct had turned cold, their eyes avoiding his whenever he passed by. Whispers filled the hallways, but none of them dared approach him. He was the pariah now, the cop who couldn't keep his temper in check. One afternoon, Maria Jenkins, his longtime partner, found him sitting alone in the break room, his head resting on his hands. Her face was tired, but her expression softened when she saw him. "You okay?" she asked, leaning against the doorframe. Her voice was gentle, but there was no disguising the concern in her tone. Michael didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the table in front of him, lost in thought. "I screwed up, Maria," he muttered, finally lifting his head. His face was a mask of frustration and regret. "I hurt people. I hurt a lot of people, and I can't take it back." Maria walked over and sat down across from him. She didn't speak for a while, letting the silence hang in the air. Michael's admission wasn't surprising, but hearing him say it out loud, admitting it to someone else, felt like a small step forward. "I know you feel like you failed," she said quietly. "But you're not the only one responsible for what happened. We both know the system is broken. You didn't create that system, but you played into it." "I was supposed to be different," Michael whispered, shaking his head. "I was supposed to be better. I was supposed to protect people. I wasn't supposed to be a part of this mess." Maria leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. "No one's perfect, Michael. But that doesn't mean you can't try to make things right." "I don't know how to fix it," he said, his voice tight. "I can't just erase everything I've done." "No, you can't," Maria agreed, her gaze unwavering. "But you can start by doing better. You can start by being honest, not just with everyone else, but with yourself." Michael let out a long breath, feeling the weight of her words settle into his chest. He knew she was right, but admitting it to himself was much harder than hearing it from someone else. His identity had been tied up in his job for so long that the idea of letting it go, of acknowledging how deep the corruption ran, was terrifying. Meanwhile, Maya Carter had been relentless. After the protest, she had kept pushing for accountability. She had taken her fight to the courts, using the video of the incident as evidence in the case against Michael. She knew this wasn't just about him, it was about the entire system that had allowed his actions to go unchallenged for so long. Every day, she spoke out for those who had been silenced, and every day, the weight of the fight seemed to grow heavier. Despite the personal toll, Maya didn't back down. She had her sights set on reform, and she knew that exposing the system's flaws was only the beginning. The city was listening, and her determination was starting to spark change, though she still had a long road ahead. But the pressure on Michael was mounting. The department had placed him on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, and the scrutiny had only intensified. His every move was being watched, and it felt like the walls were closing in. His phone buzzed late one evening as he sat in his apartment, alone. It was a message from Maria. "We need to talk." Michael hesitated for a moment before typing back. "About what?" "About how you're going to face this. About how you're going to make it right." He put the phone down and stood, pacing the small apartment. The anger he had kept hidden for so long was finally surfacing again, but it was different this time. It wasn't the rage he had used to justify his actions, it was something more primal. Guilt. Shame. Regret. When Michael met Maria the next day, he was visibly worn out, his face pale and drawn. She took one look at him and knew he was on the edge. "You look like you haven't slept in days," she observed, but her voice was softer now, less critical than before. "I can't sleep," he admitted, his voice raw. "I keep seeing his face. I keep hearing Maya's words." He paused, swallowing hard. "And I can't make it go away." Maria nodded, her eyes full of understanding. The first step in making things right is facing it, Michael. All of it. Not just what happened, but why it happened. You need to get to the root of it. I know, he said quietly, rubbing his temples. But I don't even know where to begin. Start with the truth, Maria said. Start with yourself. Michael sat in the sterile office, the smell of antiseptic and paper heavy in the air. Across from him, Dr. Ellen Harris, a psychologist specializing in law enforcement counseling, regarded him with quiet professionalism. You're here because you've made some mistakes, Dr. Harris began, her voice calm but firm. But this isn't about punishing you, it's about understanding why you acted the way you did and finding a way to change. Michael's fists clenched in his lap. He had spent years brushing aside his inner turmoil, hiding behind the badge and his authority, but now, sitting in front of a stranger, the truth was becoming unavoidable. I don't even know where to start, he said, his voice laced with frustration. I don't know how I got here. Dr. Harris nodded, her expression patient. It's often hard to see the path we've taken until we stop and look back. Let's start with why you became a cop in the first place. What was your motivation? Michael took a deep breath, thinking back to the beginning. I joined because I wanted to make a difference. I thought I could help people. But somewhere along the way, it became more about control. About proving myself. I stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as problems to solve. And what do you think that says about you? Dr. Harris asked gently. Michael's eyes narrowed. I guess it means I stopped caring. There was a long silence as Michael let her words sink in. The anger that had once fueled him now seemed distant, replaced by a gnawing emptiness that he couldn't quite explain. Dr. Harris leaned forward slightly. It's not uncommon for people in law enforcement to lose sight of the very reason they joined. The badge, the power, it can cloud your judgment. But understanding that is the first step toward reclaiming who you were meant to be. Michael nodded slowly. He was starting to understand. But understanding wasn't the same as changing. And change was terrifying. Meanwhile, Maya had been pushing forward in her own way. The trial against Michael Harding was a battle, but the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed the flaws in the system, but she had also lost a part of herself in the process. After weeks of relentless work, Maya found herself sitting in a small cafe, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages of congratulations. She had made the front page of the city's biggest newspaper, hailed as a hero for standing up against police misconduct. Yet, despite the praise, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that this was only a small victory in a much larger fight. Her brother Marcus had been calling non-stop, offering his support, but she hadn't answered. She needed to be alone with her thoughts, to process the emotional toll the case had taken on her. As she sipped her coffee, she stared out the window, her mind replaying the day of the protest and the confrontation with Michael. She had expected anger, defiance, or even an apology, but instead, she had seen something different in his eyes, regret, perhaps even fear. It made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Did he truly regret his actions, or was he just scared of the consequences? Could someone like him ever change? She wasn't sure. And that uncertainty gnawed at her. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her train of thought. It was a message from her mentor, James Porter. We need to talk. It's about the next steps. Maya sighed, putting the phone down. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if she was going to keep pushing for change, she needed to stay focused. Michael's counseling sessions continued, each one peeling back another layer of his anger and frustration. It was slow, painful work, but something in him was beginning to shift. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session, Michael walked out of the building, his head spinning. He had just admitted for the first time that he wasn't just angry at the world around him, he was angry at himself. Angry at the person he had become. He had hurt people, betrayed the trust of those he was supposed to protect, and had become someone he didn't recognize. He walked aimlessly through the city streets, the noise of traffic and people filling his ears, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought of Maya and the way she had looked at him during their confrontation, not with hatred, but with a quiet intensity that spoke volumes. She had been fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by the system. Could he ever truly make amends? Could he prove that he was capable of change? He didn't have the answers yet. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't walk away from this fight. He owed it to himself, to the people he had harmed, and to the people he could still help. Maya had been keeping a close eye on Michael's progress, though she didn't admit it to anyone. She saw the small signs, the way he had started speaking out about the flaws within the department, the way his actions seemed to be shifting. But she wasn't convinced yet. Change was hard, and it took time. And in her line of work, time was a luxury she didn't often have. But as the weeks passed, Maya began to notice something different in Michael. When they crossed paths at a community event, he approached her cautiously, his expression uncertain but sincere. "Maya," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I just want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to change. I know it's not enough, but I need you to know that I see what I did wrong." Maya studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But there was none. She didn't say anything for a moment, letting the silence stretch. Finally, she spoke. "Accountability isn't about words, Michael. It's about actions. If you're serious, you'll keep proving it." He nodded, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "I will." As he walked away, Maya couldn't help but wonder, could someone like Michael truly change? Or was this just the beginning of another chapter in a long story of systemic failure? Months had passed since Michael's conversation with Maya. He had made significant strides, but it still felt like an uphill battle. Each day presented a new challenge, whether it was confronting his colleagues about their biases or dealing with the public skepticism of his motives. Despite all his efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of reach. In his heart, he knew he had to prove himself, not just to others but to himself as well. One afternoon, Michael was called to a routine traffic stop in a neighborhood that was known for its high crime rates. He had been briefed about a potential threat, and his body was tense as he approached the car. His partner, Officer Ramirez, stood by his side, watching for any signs of danger. As Michael tapped on the window, the driver, a young black man in his 20s, rolled it down. Michael could see the fear in the man's eyes as he complied with the officer's instructions. "License and registration," Michael said, his voice calm but firm. The man complied, but as he reached for his glove compartment, his hand trembled slightly. Michael's hand instinctively went to his holster, and in that brief moment, all the old instincts rushed back: control, power, authority. His mind screamed at him to act fast, to assume the worst. But then, a voice in the back of his head stopped him. "This is your test, Michael. This is where it changes." He held his ground, resisting the urge to reach for his weapon. The man, sensing the tension, looked up at him with a mix of fear and defiance. "I'm just trying to get home," the man said, his voice shaky but steady. Michael's heart skipped a beat. The man's words cut through the noise in his mind, reminding him of everything he had learned over the past few months. He took a deep breath, remembering the lessons from his counseling sessions, the lessons that taught him how to see people, not as threats, but as human beings. "I understand," Michael said, his voice softer now. "Just take your time. No need to rush." The man nodded, visibly relieved, and handed over the documents. Michael handed them back without hesitation, then stepped away, motioning for the man to drive off. As the car pulled away, Michael exhaled, his hands still slightly trembling. He had passed the test, at least this time. But as he walked back to his patrol car, Ramirez shot him a glance. "You handled that well," Ramirez said, his tone flat but respectful. "But you've got to remember, not everyone's going to be as cooperative. Don't let your guard down." Michael nodded, his mind racing. He had done the right thing, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. Meanwhile, Maya had been embroiled in a new case involving another instance of police misconduct. A young woman had been detained by officers under questionable circumstances, and Maya had been called to investigate. The evidence was clear: excessive force had been used, and once again, the justice system had failed to protect the vulnerable. She sat in her office late that night, reviewing the case files. Her mind kept drifting back to Michael. Was he truly trying to change, or was it all a facade? She couldn't ignore the possibility that he might slip up. That one day, he might fall back into the same patterns of behavior he had exhibited before. The phone rang, pulling her from her thoughts. "Maya, we've got a situation," her mentor, James Porter, said on the other end. "A new incident just came through, something big. You need to get here now." Maya's heart sank. Another case. Another person in need of justice. But something about James's tone made her pause. There was more to this than just another protest or another call for accountability. "What's going on?" she asked, already gathering her things. "It's Michael," James replied, his voice grim. "There's been an incident. A traffic stop gone wrong." Maya felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had known this was coming. She had always known that change, if it was real, would be tested under fire. The news spread quickly. A video surfaced, showing Michael in the middle of a tense traffic stop. The incident had escalated when another officer, who was present but not visible in the video, had drawn their weapon, leading to a confrontation. The footage, which didn't capture the full context, painted Michael as a potential aggressor. Social media erupted with condemnation, and Maya's phone rang off the hook. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Michael's past was catching up with him. The community's trust was fragile, and this incident was shaking the very foundation of the progress Michael had worked so hard to build. Maya stood in front of the television, watching the news coverage with a heavy heart. She saw Michael's face on the screen, his expression unreadable, his eyes a mixture of exhaustion and regret. She wanted to believe that he had changed. But the evidence before her was hard to ignore. Was this the proof that his transformation had been nothing more than a temporary facade? Maya had always fought for justice, but now, she was caught between the man who had hurt so many and the possibility of redemption that she wasn't sure was even possible. The days after the incident felt like a blur to Michael. The media was relentless, every outlet displaying a new angle of the footage, every headline a condemnation. No matter what he did, it seemed as though there was no way to escape the shame. The accusation, the guilt, it all weighed down on him, harder than he had ever felt before. The quiet days he had spent in self-reflection were over. Now, the world was watching. Maya, too, found herself torn. She had always stood for accountability, never letting the powerful evade justice. But Michael's case was different. He had been the very embodiment of authority, the symbol of what she had fought against. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something raw and vulnerable, that made her hesitate. Was he truly changing, or was this just a temporary shift, a fleeting moment of redemption? The media coverage was relentless. The footage had spread like wildfire, and the court of public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The streets were alive with protests, each group chanting for justice, accountability, and change. Maya stood on the front lines, her heart heavy, her mind conflicted. The calls for reform were louder than ever, but now, the man who had once been the source of so much suffering was caught in the crossfire. Was it too late for him? Could he truly make amends? As the trial date approached, Michael knew that this was the moment that would define him. He had been through mandatory counseling, tried to make amends, but none of that would matter if he didn't face the consequences of his actions head-on. He was prepared for the worst. His lawyer had already told him that a guilty verdict was a certainty. The question now was whether he would face it with the dignity and courage he had spent months trying to reclaim. On the morning of the trial, Michael stood before the courthouse, his heart pounding. He felt a deep sense of shame but also a strange sense of resolve. He had been given a chance to change. Now, he had to prove that he was worthy of it. Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Maya sat on one side, watching Michael with a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. She had never been one to give second chances, but this time, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to Michael's story. Could he truly redeem himself, or was the damage irreversible? The trial unfolded in a series of emotional testimonies. Maya's team presented their evidence, each piece a hammer blow to Michael's defense. They didn't need to paint him as a villain, his own actions did the job for them. The testimonies from the community, the victims who had once looked to Michael for protection, painted a picture of betrayal. They spoke of fear, of injustice, of the system that had failed them time and time again. Michael sat in silence, his eyes trained on the floor. He wanted to look at Maya, to speak to her, but he couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze. He knew that he had let her down, and no matter how much he had changed, the damage was done. Then it was his turn. The room fell silent as he stood up, his hands trembling as he approached the witness stand. He had prepared for this moment, but nothing could prepare him for the weight of his own words. "I'm not here to deny what I've done," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with regret. "I've hurt people. I've let the badge and the power it gave me cloud my judgment. I've been a part of a system that allowed this to happen. And I've failed. Not just as a cop, but as a human being." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a brief moment, Michael felt the full weight of his actions. The years of pride, of arrogance, of believing that he was untouchable, it all seemed so distant now. In its place, there was only guilt, only the desire to make things right. He turned to face the jury, his eyes scanning the faces before him. "I can't change what I've done. But I can promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. I will work to dismantle the system that bred this behavior, and I will do everything I can to help those I've wronged. If I'm given the chance." The silence in the room was deafening. The jury exchanged looks, and even the judge appeared to be processing the weight of his words. Michael's heart raced in his chest. He had laid it all out. Now, all he could do was wait. Maya watched him, her expression unreadable. She had heard the words, but what she was waiting for wasn't just an apology. It was action. Words were easy. Change was hard. And as much as she wanted to believe him, she knew that the true test would come after the trial, when the cameras were gone and the public's attention had moved on. The judge called for a recess, and the room erupted into whispers. Michael sat back down, his body slumped in exhaustion. He had said what he needed to say. Now, the hardest part lay ahead. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, the silence oppressive as the jury deliberated. Time seemed to stretch on indefinitely, each minute a weight pressing down on Michael's chest. He sat there, his hands clenched in his lap, barely noticing the murmurs and whispers surrounding him. His mind replayed the same question over and over: what if the verdict was more than he could bear? What if, despite everything he had tried to do, the outcome was still a reflection of the man he used to be? Maya sat across the room, her gaze fixed on the proceedings, but her mind was elsewhere. The fight for justice had always been clear-cut in her mind. But Michael had made her question everything. Was he truly remorseful, or was he just trying to save himself? The weight of his apology, his commitment to change, lingered in her thoughts, but it couldn't outweigh the evidence. The damage was done, and accountability was paramount. She couldn't let him off the hook, no matter how convincing his words had been. Her thoughts were interrupted when the bailiff stepped forward, holding the verdict in his hand. The room grew even quieter, the tension nearly unbearable. Every eye was on him as he approached the judge, who nodded solemnly. The bailiff turned toward the jury box, and then the judge addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice firm. "Will the defendant please rise?" Michael stood, his knees weak, but his posture straight. The moment had come. He had done everything he could to show that he was ready to change, but there was no telling what the jury would decide. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. The judge nodded toward the foreman, who stood and addressed the court. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Michael Carter, guilty of misconduct under color of law." The words hit Michael like a sledgehammer. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He had expected it, he had known it was coming, but hearing it out loud was something else entirely. It felt like the walls of the courtroom were closing in on him. He wasn't surprised, but the weight of the verdict still crushed him, deeper than any physical punishment ever could. He glanced over at Maya, who sat motionless, her expression unreadable. He could almost see the relief in her eyes, the relief of knowing that justice had been served. But even that relief came with a cost. For both of them, this wasn't just a legal victory, it was a reminder of the system they had both been a part of, a system that had failed so many. The judge continued, her voice steady. Michael Carter, you are hereby sentenced to 2 years of community service and mandatory rehabilitation training. Your law enforcement credentials will be permanently revoked. The words reverberated in Michael's mind. His career was over. The badge he had worn with such pride, now, it would never be part of his life again. The sentence wasn't as harsh as many had expected, but it was still significant. It marked the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of something unknown. As the judge adjourned the court, Michael felt a strange sense of finality. This was the moment he had been dreading, yet in some ways, it was also a relief. No more running. No more hiding behind his uniform. Now, the real work began. Maya stood as the room began to empty, her heart pounding. She had won. The system had won. But something about Michael's downfall left her conflicted. She had fought for this, fought for accountability, but seeing the man who had once wielded so much power brought to his knees didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a reminder of how deeply flawed the system was. She approached Michael as he slowly made his way out of the courtroom. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no animosity, no triumph. Just a shared understanding that neither of them could ever go back to who they had been before. 2 years, Maya said softly, her voice steady. It's not enough, but it's a start. Michael nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of regret and something deeper. Was it hope? I don't know what comes next, Maya. But I'm not giving up on trying to change. Maya's gaze softened, but her resolve remained. Don't waste the second chance, Michael. You've taken the first step. Now, you need to keep moving forward. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Michael standing alone, finally facing the consequences of his actions. The crowd around him seemed to part, as though giving him space to breathe, but there was no escape from the truth. He had been held accountable, and now it was up to him to prove that he could change. Months passed, and Michael found himself in a community center, a place where he had never imagined he would be, much less speaking to a group of people whose lives had been affected by the very system he had once sworn to uphold. The community service component of his sentence had become an inescapable reminder of the damage he had caused. His first session was brutal. The room was filled with people who had seen firsthand how power could be abused, how those who were meant to protect them had turned their backs, or worse, used their authority to harm. Michael could feel the eyes on him, heavy with judgment, yet he forced himself to stand tall. He had to speak. He had to start somewhere. Good morning, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I'm Michael Carter. I've been assigned here as part of my community service. I've made mistakes, and I'm here to listen. I'm not here to justify what I did. I just want to start by hearing your stories. The silence in the room was thick. It was as though no one trusted him, and for good reason. He was a symbol of everything they had fought against, a former officer of the law who had once stood in their way. Finally, a woman in the back of the room stood up. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her expression unreadable. What makes you think you can fix this? She asked, her voice cold and sharp. How do we know you're not just here because you got caught? That you don't really care about us? Michael swallowed, the sting of her words cutting through him. He had no answer. How could he? He had spent so many years closing his eyes to the pain his actions had caused. Now, he was forced to face it, to hear it. Another voice broke through the tension, this time a man who had been sitting quietly at the back of the room. You want to change? Then start by listening, he said. Don't talk about what you've done. We've heard enough of that. Show us you get it. That you understand what we've been through. Michael nodded slowly. He had no idea how to make amends, how to prove he was truly sorry, but the weight of their words was beginning to sink in. He had to keep going. If he was going to change, he had to accept that this was just the beginning. The first few weeks were the hardest. Every time he stepped into the community center, the faces of those he had wronged were a constant reminder of his failures. And yet, the more he listened, the more he began to understand. It wasn't just about the isolated incidents he had been a part of, it was about a systemic problem, one that ran deeper than he had ever realized. He wasn't just a bad apple in the system. The system itself was broken. And that brokenness had hurt so many people, far beyond his actions alone. As the weeks passed, Michael started opening up in the group sessions. He spoke about the anger that had always simmered inside him, the fear of feeling powerless, and how he had allowed that fear to shape his actions. His words were raw, but they were real. At first, people were skeptical. They didn't trust him. And he couldn't blame them. But slowly, Michael began to earn their respect, not by offering excuses, but by showing up every day, by listening, and by never shying away from the uncomfortable truths. There was one moment, in particular, that stood out to him, when a young woman named Jasmine shared her story. She had been wrongfully accused of a crime, a victim of racial profiling. Her voice cracked as she described the trauma she'd endured, the way the system had failed her at every turn. "I was just a kid," she said, tears in her eyes. "And they treated me like I was guilty before I even said a word." The room fell silent as Michael absorbed her words. He couldn't help but feel the weight of the guilt pressing down on him. He had been a part of the system that had done this to her, and countless others like her. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the damage he had been complicit in. After the session, Michael pulled Jasmine aside. His voice was quiet but sincere. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know words can't change anything, but I'm trying to be better. I want to help fix this." Jasmine looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, perhaps for any sign that he was truly genuine. Finally, she nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Keep showing up," she said. "That's the only way." Michael didn't know if he would ever fully earn their forgiveness. Maybe he didn't deserve it. But he knew one thing for certain, this path he was on, though difficult, was the only one worth walking. It wasn't about clearing his conscience. It was about making sure that he was never again a part of the problem. As the months wore on, Michael's life began to take shape in a way that he never thought possible. The daily struggle of facing those he had wronged, coupled with his own internal battles, had begun to carve out something new in him. It wasn't easy. In fact, it was excruciating at times, but there was a shift, a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. One afternoon, after another session at the community center, Michael walked out into the parking lot to find his supervisor, Chief Maria Alvarez, waiting for him. The last time they had spoken, there had been a bitter tension between them. He had resented her for her role in his downfall, but now, as he looked at her standing there, waiting with a calm, steady gaze, he realized how much he had changed. "Michael," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You're not the same man I arrested. But there's still work to be done." He nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I know," he replied quietly. "I'm trying. I'm really trying." Maria studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You've done good work here. But it's not just about your work in the community center. It's about everything, the way you carry yourself, how you speak up when you see injustice. I know you didn't start out with those intentions, but it's how you're moving forward now that counts." Her words struck him deeply. She wasn't giving him a free pass, and she wasn't pretending he hadn't done damage. But there was something in her eyes, something like understanding, maybe even a bit of pride. "I won't stop," he said, his voice steady. "I've learned that it's not enough to just say I'm sorry. I have to show it." Maria gave a small, approving nod. "That's the first step. Keep it up." As he drove home that evening, Michael found himself reflecting on her words. This wasn't just about changing the opinions of the people around him. It wasn't about restoring his career or his reputation. It was about confronting the ugliness inside himself and deciding that he wasn't going to let it define him anymore. The next day, Michael sat in another session, this time with a larger group, listening as one of the victims of police brutality shared his painful experience. The man, a young father named Carlos, recounted how he had been falsely arrested, humiliated, and subjected to violence simply because of the color of his skin. His voice trembled with anger and sorrow, but there was no escaping the reality of his words. "I could have been anybody," Carlos said, his eyes locked on Michael's. "But because of people like you, I wasn't treated like a person. I was treated like a threat." Michael felt his stomach churn. It wasn't the first time he had heard stories like this, but it was the first time he truly understood the depth of the pain he had been a part of causing. There was no denying it. He had been a cog in a machine that had dehumanized people, that had perpetuated fear, distrust, and violence. The silence in the room stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. But this time, Michael didn't shy away. He stood up slowly, his hands shaking slightly, and looked directly at Carlos. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't take back what I did. But I want to help fix it. And I know it's not enough just to say that. But I'm going to do everything I can." Carlos didn't say anything at first. He just stared at Michael, perhaps weighing the sincerity of his words. Finally, he nodded, just a small, barely perceptible gesture, but it was enough. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. A recognition that Michael was trying in ways that were painful, uncomfortable, and humbling. He wasn't perfect. He never would be. But he was choosing to be better. Later that week, Michael received a call from his lawyer, informing him that there was a possibility of his record being expunged after his community service was completed and his rehabilitation had progressed. Michael had been given the chance to rebuild his life, to remove the stain of his past actions from his permanent record. But as the offer lingered in his mind, he realized something crucial. He didn't want to erase his past. Not because he enjoyed it, but because he needed to carry it with him. It was part of the story he had to tell. It was part of the reason he was trying so hard to be better. "I don't want it expunged," he told his lawyer. "I need people to see what I've done. I need them to know that change is possible, but it doesn't come without a cost." As the days turned into weeks, Michael's commitment to change began to take root in ways that surprised him. He started speaking at public forums, sharing his story, not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of the possibility for redemption. He became an advocate, not just for the communities he had once harmed, but for the officers who had been trapped in the same cycle of corruption he had been. But deep down, Michael knew that redemption wouldn't be handed to him. It wasn't a one-time event or a magic moment. It was a continuous process, one that demanded honesty, accountability, and unwavering dedication. And though he wasn't sure what the future held for him, he knew one thing for certain: he was finally on the right path. The day of the public forum had arrived. Michael stood backstage, nerves twisting in his stomach. He had spoken at smaller events before, but this was different. This was his chance to share his story on a larger scale, to show the world that it was possible for someone to change. He took a deep breath and adjusted his tie, trying to steady himself. He had come a long way from the man he used to be, the man who had worn a badge but lacked the empathy to understand the pain he was inflicting on others. As he stepped onto the stage, he was greeted by a sea of faces. Some were curious, some skeptical, and some hopeful. But he didn't look at them like he had before. He didn't see them as an audience to be won over. He saw them as individuals, people who had their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of pain. "Thank you for having me here today," Michael began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know many of you probably never expected to hear my name again. But here I am. Not because I want forgiveness, but because I want to be part of the change I once fought against." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. The silence was palpable. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of expectation. I used to believe that being a police officer meant I was above reproach, Michael continued. I thought that my badge gave me the right to make decisions for others. But I was wrong. I didn't see the damage I was causing, the lives I was ruining with my actions. It wasn't until I was forced to confront my own mistakes that I realized the truth. He scanned the room, meeting the eyes of a few people who nodded in understanding. He saw anger, but he also saw hope. The realization that even someone who had fallen so far could rise again, it sparked something. A tiny flame of hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible for others too. I can't change what I did, Michael continued. And I don't expect anyone to forgive me right away. What I can do, though, is show up every single day and prove that I'm trying. That I'm learning. That I'm not the person I was when I wore that uniform. He took a moment to collect himself. To the people I hurt, to the communities I wronged, this is my apology. Not in words, but in action. It's not enough to say I'm sorry. I have to prove it. And I will. As he finished his speech, there was a moment of stillness. And then, slowly, a round of applause began. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was quiet, almost reverent. But it was real. For the first time in a long time, Michael felt a sense of peace settle within him. When the event ended, Michael received many messages of support, some from people who had long since lost hope in the possibility of change. He had done something that very few people ever managed to do. He had faced his demons, taken responsibility for his actions, and made the commitment to do better. His work wasn't done. There was still a long road ahead of him, still communities to rebuild, relationships to repair. But Michael knew that the journey was worth it. And in his heart, he believed that if he could change, others could too. Conclusion. As Michael's story comes to a close, it's clear that redemption isn't a destination, it's a journey. It's about facing the hardest truths, taking responsibility, and having the courage to change, even when it feels impossible. Michael's transformation is a testament to the power of self-reflection, accountability, and a willingness to make things right, no matter how long it takes. We hope Michael's journey has touched your heart and inspired you to reflect on your own path toward growth and change. The road to redemption isn't easy, but it's always worth it. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If Michael's story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Touching Tales for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories. Tap the bell icon to get notified every time we upload a new video. Comment below and let us know your thoughts. Do you believe in second chances? What do you think about the power of redemption? We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and remember, change starts with you.